What's happening, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Well, guys, the greatest scourge to public parks is finally being tackled in Fort Lauderdale, where brave police officers are risking their lives to make sure people like this are being held accountable for their crimes.
90-year-old Arnold Abbott prepares hundreds of meals each week for the homeless in the kitchen of the Sanctuary Church.
We serve two entrees at every feeding.
But Abbott's work now has him in trouble with the law.
Why is he being arrested?
Shame on you! Shame on you!
He faces possible jail time and a $500 fine for feeding the homeless after he was charged Sunday with violating a new ordinance that virtually outlaws groups from sharing food with the hungry in the city.
Amazingly, it's not just Fort Lauderdale that's wasting city resources harassing the elderly for simply feeding the hungry. In fact, according to the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, at least 187 U.S. cities have laws criminalizing everything from begging to sleeping in public. 17 cities have ordinances that specifically prohibit individuals and private organizations from sharing food with homeless people. Now, proponents claim that these laws actually help the homeless by forcing them to seek out centralized city-run programs. You know, just like the kind of programs that are seen as simply fat to be trimmed from bloated government budgets. Bottom line is that this is a really cruel attack on the poor. People already ignore the homeless in so many ways, but to delegate them to the status of pesky ducks is downright shameful. And laws like this only speak to the real scourge on society. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you're watching your neck, but you need to tune in because we're breaking the set.
All throughout Tuesday night, the corporate media repeatedly feigned surprise at the lopsided nature of the midterm elections. But the real shocker is that this year's midterm only saw an estimated 36.6% turnout among eligible voters. And when you dig into the numbers, the skewed makeup of the voting populace starts to come to light. See, according to exit poll data compiled by Edison Research, a whopping 75% of the electorate was white, 12% black, and 8% Hispanic. And while these numbers represent a slight increase in diversity compared to 2010, the fact remains that if those who voted actually reflected the changing racial and ethnic makeup of the U.S., there would be a far higher turnout among minorities. Moving on to age, where young voters 18 to 29 stayed home in droves, representing a mere 13% of the electorate, a number nearly identical to 2010, but a far cry from 2012, when nearly 1 in 5 voters was under 30. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, those making less than 50 grand a year represented only 36% of the electorate, despite making up half of the entire U.S. population. Now, when you consider that minorities, young people, and the poor are the groups most impacted by policies in Washington, it seems strange that they wouldn't want their voices heard. But in fact, it's these three demographics that are the most unlikely to vote, according to a recent study by Pew Research Center. See, a small, rich, white electorate is easy to control and manipulate, and low turnout among other groups is exactly what the establishment wants. And voting systems have all been implemented across the country designed to achieve just that. Thanks to a strict GOP-backed voter ID law passed in Texas, an estimated 600,000 people that were eligible to vote couldn't because they didn't have the means of obtaining a photo ID. In North Carolina, 7 early voting days and same-day registration were abolished for the first time, meaning that those who work multiple minimum wage jobs have even less opportunity than before to take time away to go vote. And in Florida, 1.3 million people that had been convicted of crimes but already served their time were banned altogether, representing the harshest voting restriction on former inmates in the nation. Of course, all of these laws are passed in the name of stamping out voter fraud, a horrible epidemic plaguing this nation. Actually, not so much. According to the book The Myth of Voter Fraud by Lorraine Minette, prosecutions for migratory bird law violations were still far more common during the 2005 fiscal year. And we all know how common migratory bird law violations are. Of course, voter suppression is only one part of the equation when it comes to keeping these dangerous demographics away from the polls. The Democratic Party consistently panders to minority groups only in the days and weeks before an election, when desperate times call for desperate measures. And after Obama announced that he would not be taking any executive action on immigration reform until after the midterms, it's no wonder why Latinos weren't interested in supporting either party. This self-serving political move largely exposed the party for what it's become, one that's completely terrified of tackling any controversial legislation if it could possibly hurt its political standing with moderate voters. Of course, the calculation to sit on badly needed immigration reform really paid off in this year's election, so way to go, Dems! But the larger point is that if minorities, the young and lower class, truly had the opportunity to express their political will to the fullest, the establishment wouldn't know what to do. And if these groups ever manage to overcome the manufactured obstacles and purposeful injected apathy consistently keeping them away from the booths, you can bet that that entrenched two-party system will finally fall apart. After filmmaker Kip Anderson's environmental awakening, he became obsessively conscious about his personal impact on the world. But his life drastically changed when he found out that the main culprit of planetary destruction was actually being shielded by leading environmental organizations. It's an issue that he tackles in his new documentary, Cowspiracy, and he joins me now to discuss. Thank you so much for coming on, Kip.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the latest UN report on climate change contains dire warnings about the future of this planet. If humans do not immediately and collectively reduce carbon emissions, Kip, how much does factory farming, beef and specifically, impact climate change?
Well, it's one of the leading, if not the leading causes, depending on what stat you see. It's everything from 18% of human-caused greenhouse gases all the way up to 51% compared to transportation, which is only 13%. Yet this is not being told to us by the leading environmental groups such as Greenpeace and Sierra Club and all these. It's essentially kind of being hidden from us.
And photographer Mishka Henner recently took some aerial shots of factory farming in the U.S. They look horrific. I mean, they look like festering zombie wounds here. What the hell are these giant red and toxic green masses even comprised of, and what effects do these kind of cesspools have on the environment?
Yeah, so it's basically causing the greenhouse gases. Methane is up to, some studies show 85 times more potent than CO2, and that's what's really causing this human-caused greenhouse gases. It's a lot more than the transportation. So it's it's just incredibly destructive, and that's only one part of the many, many things that else it does, including water use and land use and rainforest destruction, species extinction as well.
Absolutely. How does America compare to the rest of the world when it comes to factory farming?
Well, and also it's not only factory farming. With America, we have so much land. It's also the grass-fed and the pasture raising. This what really affects the wolves and the wild horses. There's more wild horses in captivity than there are free on the land because of these huge, our land use is around 45% upwards for animal agriculture. So it's not only factory farming, it's all of this animal agriculture.
That's an incredible statistic right there. And let's talk about water, because this is another very stunning facet of the documentary. I wanted to play a clip from Cowspiracy about just how much water is wasted in the process of raising cattle.
I found out that 1 quarter-pound hamburger requires over 660 gallons of water to produce. Here I've been taking these short showers trying to save water, and to find out just eating 1 hamburger is the equivalent of showering 2 entire months. So much attention is given to lowering our home water use, yet domestic water use is only 5% of what is consumed in the U.S. versus 55% for animal agriculture.
Kip, amazingly, Beef Magazine responded to this point in your film, saying 713 gallons of water go into the production of 1 cotton t-shirt, and nearly 3,900 gallons, 39,000 gallons are used to build a car. So what's the big deal to waste a few hundred to consume a hamburger?
That's the funniest thing is that was the greatest stat that they could give to tell the ranchers to combat, damage control for this film. That was the only one. And it's as if we eat a T-shirt a day or even a T-shirt a week or even a month, whereas, people are consuming meat once, twice a day, and even if it's once a week, as we said, one hamburger is the equivalent of showering 2 entire months. And, in California, we're in a drought, yet this is not being told to us.
Right, and then, a T-shirt can last your whole life, and a car as well. And some people eat, 2 to 3 hamburgers a day. That is an insane amount of water being wasted, and that's just the waste. Of course, California has that drought going on. Let's talk about water pollution. This was really fascinating, too. You spoke to the Surfrider Foundation about this very issue. They seem completely unaware of the vast cattle production going on all over Southern California. Why do you think that is?
Well, a lot of it is, for all these environmental groups, part of it is ignorance. Part of it is that they just don't feel that it's a win, particularly a win, quote-unquote, win campaign where they can gather more money, more donors. As we say, it's profits over planet. And part of it's just ignorance. They just aren't really aware of this because it's just not really told to us in the general media outlets, even though it's a simple Google search to find that the leading cause of water pollution by far is animal agriculture, as well as contamination and, as you saw, water use.
Kip, really? The film is called Cowspiracy. I find it really hard to believe that these people are just ignorant. If they are such hardcore environmental activists, it took you, you easily transitioned to realizing that this was a huge facet. This guy has cattle production going on in his backyard. He's in Southern California. I don't know, man. It just seems like there is another reason for this wall of silence.
Yeah, well, it's, trifold. Not only is it, they just really don't feel like Greenpeace, there's so many supporters, they don't feel that it'll gather them more money or supporters. So it's not necessarily a win campaign. They just don't see it being a long-term, money generator and to get them more funding. But it is also ignorance. And that's what's so fun about the film is it follows my journey where we interview each of these different organizations, and it's hilarious if it wasn't so disturbing, each of these interviews, if it wasn't so serious, that they're really the ones that need to tell us this.
Right, exactly. And I think a lot has to do with the meat lobby. How much impact does this lobby have over government policy and the perpetuation of this kind of rampant unaccountability when it comes to the environment?
And that's, to defend these environmental groups, partly it is that, partly is there's a silence on them. For fearful there'll be some backlash against the government. The meat industry has such an incredible, powerful lobby group that some of these industries and these environmental groups and people in general are frightened to talk out with these ag-gag laws and other things that have snuck into even the Patriot Act. And that's another one. And also there's some ties to these industries, to the meat lobby industry, and to the heads of the organizations, the board of directors, to some of these environmental groups that they cross over, smartly so, for the beef and animal agriculture industry to kind of get in the ropes with the very groups that should be calling them out, yet they're kind of going into bed with them.
Right, and Will Potter, of course, tackling those ag laws head on with his drones flying over factory farms. I love that you interviewed him in that film. Let's talk about subsidies here, because you mentioned kind of that ridiculous amount of land that's being wasted to just simply raise livestock. How are government subsidies exacerbating the problem, land, feed, and livestock?
Yeah, the subsidies is unbelievable. Subsidies to these grains that they eat, the corn, the soy. We have the author of Meatonomics, which is a great book in the film, and there's a study that show this is on the low end, that for say someone eating a Big Mac that costs around $3 to $4 without subsidies could cost, or should cost really, around $13 to $15, and there's other studies by say Dr. Openlander that could cost $20 to $30 that you don't even know how of what these products do to not only the environment but to our health, that we're then paying through these healthcare benefits as well. It just goes on and on and on. Right.
I feel like if meat really cost its true amount, I think people would really wake up. First of all, they wouldn't eat nearly as much, but they would maybe say, hey, why does this cost so much? Oh, wait, that's the real cost of meat. Due to these subsidies, it's just incredible. Let's talk about what we can do here, because I think people are really adverse to kind of the thought of going full vegan. How can people eat meat more responsibly, and is there anything that we can do to attack this issue head on?
Well, really it is to inform yourself. You can't make a wise decision until you inform yourself. That's what's great about this film. It's a really entertaining narrative. So watch the film, and once you inform yourself, then you can make the decision to see that, is it sustainable? Is even backyard sustainable? Is grass-fed sustainable? Is organic? And you know, follow the journey and do your own research to find out that it really, really isn't. And once you do that, then you watch films such as Forks Over Knives to see that not only is it bad for the environment, it's really bad for your health.
Kip.
And then once you inform yourself, then you can see.
Thank you so much, Kip Anderson, Cowspiracy. Everyone check it out. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Coming up, I'll speak with a doctor tackling the violence-ridden streets of Guatemala City. Stay tuned.
You know that guy who wishes someone would spy on him? How about the woman who enjoys being lied to by her government? This citizen can't get enough congressional inaction, and this taxpayer wants the mainstream media to be more corporatized. While this person would rather eat genetically modified food, this one thinks our prisons are not crowded enough. And what do these people have in common? They don't exist.
Latin America is officially the most violent region in the world, according to the UN. And Guatemala is at the crux of the volatility, stemming from its long and bloody civil war. The country is rife with brutality, where gang violence rules and unaccountable murder is rampant. It's definitely not the safest place for paramedics, but amazingly, there are troops of volunteer doctors, or bomberos voluntarios, that act as the guardian angels of Guatemala City, selflessly responding to horrific crime scenes despite a severe lack of government resources. One of those men is Dr. Jorge Chu, who was recently profiled on Vice by Getty photographer Kyle Clark. Well, they both joined me earlier, and I first asked Chu why he said he needs to be a mechanic, doctor, paramedic, and firefighter in order to do his job.
Down, you know, in Guatemala, obviously, budgets for every government institution and any type of institution is very limited. So the same thing with our equipment. We sometimes have to do miracles, you know, to make our equipment last and work. So yeah, I kind of make reference of that in the video just because the car that I had was a 1987 beat-up Land Cruiser. So definitely has some mechanical issues, and in order, you know, just to report a car that is not working well, I know if I do that, I will not be able to go and do runs. So definitely, you know, you have to know a little bit of different and kind of improvise and try to make it the best you can with the little that you have. So.
And Doctor, in 2012, there were about 100 murders per week in a country of 15 million, where a hired assassin can make about $20 per execution. Paint a picture of the reality that you encounter on the streets on a daily basis and what life is like for those living in the most dangerous areas of Guatemala City.
Well, absolutely. I think history has a lot to do with that. You have to remember that during the late 70s, early 80s, we had the Civil War between guerrilla groups and the military in Guatemala, and everything was militarized. I mean, the militaries were the one in power, and they were the ones that were dictating the conduct to be done in Guatemala. And during that time, the military actually came to small Indian communities and totally wiped them out. So these people started fleeing, you know, up north to Chiapas, to Mexico, and obviously to the United States, trying to survive, actually. So we have that culture of aggression and war already, like, embedded in our, you know, in our society. And then when the people started getting deported, mostly in the 90s, these people actually, to protect themselves in LA majorly, they formed little gangs because they were getting abused by the existing gangs in LA, especially the gangs of the black gangs, like the Crips, the Bloods. So these people kind of organized themselves because being undocumented obviously meant that they couldn't go to the police if they got raped, if they get robbed. And they started forming this MS-13 and the Gang 18. Well, when these people started getting deported to Guatemala, Guatemala couldn't offer them anything. They came to Guatemala with no family because their family stayed in the States, no job, no record of working, no credit line. So the only thing that they knew was, kind of do this extortion that they used to do in their gangs up north. And on top of that, the leftovers of the Civil War that we had, the peace treaty was signed until 1996. So there were still a lot of guns around, circulating around mostly all the country. And you combine a high load of guns with very low, below poverty line population, and that's kind of a prescription for chaos.
Indeed. Giles, according to Newsweek, 98% of all crimes in Guatemala go unprosecuted. I mean, that is a stunning statistic right there. From your studies and experience in the country, what do you think is the cause of such rampant unaccountability? Is it just the result of that legacy of civil war and corruption?
I think a massive drug trade as well. Sure, I think the culture of the gangs has now become such an epidemic that it leaves really no community untouched. Bear in mind that the poverty rate is 65 to 70% anyway, which means that most people can't really afford to do anything other than just eat, So it's very difficult when you have this flow of drugs and the amount of weapons, and then there's a lawless, the police. I remember being there once. I was actually in El Salvador, just across the border, but it's the same thing in Guatemala. Is that, we stopped. I was with a police unit, and they stopped a driver who was completely drunk, and they just, he'd been in a fight or something, and they couldn't breathalyze him because they have no money for breathalyzers. So there's no real control within the police force unless they really have a dead clear case, and even then it's pretty easy to get away from it. So that 98% is very, very real. I mean, people are getting away with murder.
Right. I mean, speaking of that lack of resources there, Doctor, even though you're strictly volunteering your services, I find it shocking that there are no doctors on call for the fire department. I can't imagine the choices you have to make in terms of what disasters to respond to. Why are there so few medical resources allocated for one of the most crime-stricken cities in the world?
Well, I think like any third world country with the budget, they try to, kind of minimize to the minimum. And unfortunately, a lot of politics that get to the power, they take advantage of their positions to become a little bit richer, I guess. So that actually brings, this type of problem. And the other thing also is, for example, I volunteer my work. I don't charge or I don't earn anything from the fire department. And this is a vision that I had since I was a little kid. I wanted to help. I wanted to become a firefighter. It just happens that, obviously, being a firefighter, you don't make money, of course, in Guatemala. So I went into medical school. I became a heart surgeon. But definitely, the need for paramedic services in Guatemala is enormous. And one of the things that happens also is since 1968, we have two major hospitals in Guatemala City to take care of the poor people, which is it's public health. We have a mixed system with private and public health. But the problem is that they haven't been funded well, and every year there's cutoffs. So we have reached a point right now where even one of the main hospitals went on strike. The population just in the city has grown 300% from that time. So it's impossible that those same hospitals with the same amount of beds without being remodeled will take 300% more patients when they barely could work during that time. So right now, I think the health system in Guatemala, it's almost to the border of collapse. Last week, the Ministry of Health actually resigned his post because there was one of the main hospitals closed for a couple of weeks. And crime has been just escalating. And the thing is, what Giles was talking about the drug trade, the salaries, even for the police officers and people enforcing the law and politicians as well, is, it's not that high to compare to what the cartels are willing to pay for them to work for them. So this is something that obviously it's not very easy to be treated or to be managed.
Giles, talk to us about what the most powerful image was that you photographed in Guatemala.
There were many. I mean, following being with Dr. Chu for those weeks, there were many moments. The moment that really, when it came home to me, was last month, a bus driver every day was shot and killed. The bus companies are run by the gangs. We answered a call one day out on the freeway, just outside of Guatemala City, and we arrived at carnage. I mean, there was the one particular image, I think, is the lady who was been shot through the back of the head. A 25-year-old lady, her boyfriend was the driver who died on the way to the hospital, and her mother was outside the bus with the family, and it was a really powerfully tragic scene. But of course, the doctor did everything he could to try and save the driver, who then, on the way to the hospital, died. But that was possibly the moment for me when you realize that really no one is free of this violence. I mean, these were just two people going home on the bus. I think there were more people actually killed that night as well on the bus. I think but that particular one image was the one that the lady slumped on the seat of the bus.
Unreal. Giles, you recently launched a GoFundMe site to help raise $10,000 for a new truck for Dr. Chu, in which you got almost $14,000, which is definitely a good start to maintain the doctor's work. But how else can people contribute to help the doctor? And more importantly, how can we expand his network so the brunt of all this work isn't falling directly on his shoulders?
Basically, we need to find him, you know, more equipment, because that's the real problem. It's just that it's the daily crime rate, which is ballooning, and the lack of resources. So, I mean, obviously it would be a help. All the money that in the fund goes directly to the doctor and to the people he's training. More importantly, to the people he's training, because the thing is, the doctor does this on his own, but usually the paramedics are not trained to deal with any kind of trauma until they, you know, their job is to literally pick up the patient or the victim and put them into the EMT wagon and then take them to the hospital. So what Dr. Chu's trying to do there is create these classes and create this training which enables the paramedics to be better equipped with better equipment to deal with this situation.
Doctor, finally, I mean, so many people wouldn't do your job even if they were paid $1 million a week to do it. You do it for free. What keeps you going? Why have you committed your life to doing this insanely dangerous work?
I think I have taken it as a challenge. I started with this a long time ago, and I felt like I have been making a difference in the fire department and the way they treat emergencies. So for me, it's something that fulfills me, not with money, but with something much bigger than that.
Thank you so much. Incredibly inspiring. Dr. Jorge Chu, photographer, Giles Clark, you guys are both awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for watching, you guys. Join me tomorrow when I break the set all over again. What's happening, folks? I'm Abby Martin, and this is Breaking the Set. Well, guys, the greatest scourge to public parks is finally being tackled in Fort Lauderdale, where brave police officers are risking their lives to make sure people like this are being held accountable for their crimes.
90-year-old Arnold Abbott prepares hundreds of meals each week for the homeless in the kitchen of the Sanctuary Church.
We serve two entrees at every feeding.
But Abbott's work now has him in trouble with the law.
Why is he being arrested?
Shame on you! Shame on you!
He faces possible jail time and a $500 fine.
18 to 29 stayed home in droves, representing a mere 13% of the electorate, a number nearly identical to 2010, but a far cry from 2012, when nearly 1 in 5 voters was under 30. Finally, and perhaps most significantly, those making less than $50 grand a year represented only 36% of the electorate, despite making up half of the entire U.S. population. Now, when you consider that minorities, young people, and the poor are the groups most impacted by policies in Washington, it seems strange that they wouldn't want their voices heard. But in fact, it's these 3 demographics that are the most unlikely to vote, according to a recent study by Pew Research Center. See, a small, rich, white electorate is easy to control and manipulate.
Fine for feeding the homeless after he was charged Sunday with violating a new ordinance that virtually outlaws groups from sharing food with the hungry in the city.
Amazingly, it's not just Fort Lauderdale that's wasting city resources harassing the elderly for simply feeding the hungry. In fact, according to the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, at least 187 U.S. cities have laws criminalizing everything from begging to sleeping in public. 17 cities have ordinances that specifically prohibit individuals and private organizations from sharing food with homeless people. Now, proponents claim that these laws actually help the homeless by forcing them to seek out centralized city-run programs. You know, just like the kind of programs that are seen as simply fat to be trimmed from bloated government budgets. All throughout Tuesday night, the corporate media repeatedly feigned surprise at the lopsided nature of the midterm elections. But the real shocker is that this year's midterm only saw an estimated 36.6% turnout among eligible voters. And when you dig into the numbers, the skewed makeup of the voting populace starts to come to light. See, according to exit poll data compiled by Edison Research, a whopping 75% of the electorate was white, 12% black, and 8% Hispanic. And while these numbers represent a slight increase in diversity compared to 2010, the fact remains that if those who voted actually reflected the changing racial and ethnic makeup of the U.S., there would be a far higher turnout among minorities. Moving on to age, where young voters, bottom line is that this is a really cruel attack on the poor. People already ignore the homeless in so many ways, but to delegate them to the status of pesky ducks is downright shameful. And laws like this only speak to the real scourge on society. Now let's break the set.
Speculation has been replacing hard fact.
Terrorists don't read Twitter.
Who's right and who's wrong?
It was a terrible thing to say, period.
The mistake entirely on me.
What we need is to question more and to keep it uncensored, real and raw. These words are hard hitting, you watching your neck, but you need to tune in, cause we're